Number 1. My parents have lived in the same house for the past 25 years. I spent more than half my life living there. I'm 34 now, with children of my own, and currently living about an hour away, but I visit as much as I can. This story happened when I was 24. I had 2 children, and was going through a rough spot with my partner. As such, I was staying with my folks for a few months. My mum, dad, 19-year-old sister, and 26-year-old brother all lived there. I stayed in a bedroom with my kids. My sister had her own room, as did my parents, obviously. My brother was staying in a room in the basement. My mother is probably the sweetest and most honest woman you'll ever meet. Now, when I say she's honest, I mean that she hates lying. She's really bad at it, and she's just a very serious person. I can't tell you how many times I tried to get her to lie for me when I was growing up, and she just couldn't. Whenever she tried to lie to my dad about me getting suspended or caught smoking or whatever, her lying was always so horrible he never believed her. She always ended up telling him the truth. The reason I'm saying this is because my mum told me something that I know is true, simply because of how my mum is. One day, she and I were in the kitchen. I was talking to her about something while eating at the table. She was washing the dishes. I remember her looking over towards the den door. In the den is the door to the backyard. The stairs heading down to the basement are also in there. Back in the 80s, there was a fire in the den and half the basement. The man who lived there died. He was burned alive. His family ended up rebuilding the den and basement. The basement was pretty typical. Hard concrete floor and walls. It had 2 rooms. One we kept the washer-dryer in. The other had a big freezer and a small space. That was my brother's room. Anyway, I see my mum looking towards the den. She dropped a glass cup in the sink and just kind of stared. I asked my mum what was wrong. She quickly looked away and said, "Nothing." I didn't think anything of it. That is, until a few days later. I entered the house and saw my mum praying on her deceased mother's rosaries. My parents aren't religious. My dad is an atheist, and though my mum is technically a Christian, she doesn't go to church or read the Bible. Rarely does she pray. To see her praying on my grandma's rosaries surprised me to say the least. "Hey, you okay?" I asked. My mum then smiled and said something to the effect of, "You ever see anything in this house?" I told her no, which was true. I knew what she was getting at, but I'd never experienced any paranormal presences in my mum's house. Sure, it has its bumps and creaks, but what older house doesn't? I asked her why. She then told me what had been happening to her. She told me that she could smell matches every so often, especially when she was in the den or basement. No one smokes in our house. We aren't big on candles either, so it was kind of weird. What she told me next terrified me. She told me that she'd been seeing a man with burned, melted skin. No hair, skin just a glossy red and black. She said he had a hunch-like back, like he walked bending over a bit. Said he was naked, but that she never saw any genitals. She just felt like it was a man. She told me she saw him sometimes. At first, she thought it was her mind playing tricks. The sightings happened almost immediately after we first moved in. She only saw him a couple of times throughout my childhood and teen years, but recently she had been seeing him more, and it wasn't just a brief out of the corner of her eye thing. He would stand in full view and just look at her. She said maybe for a minute, but it felt like longer. She didn't know why he was showing himself more now. I didn't believe her at first. I was like, yeah, okay mum. But she insisted, and then she started crying. I had to believe her. She asked me again if I had noticed anything strange, and again I told her no. After my mum told me this, I was very uncomfortable in that house. Every time my then 8-month-old baby would babble or stare at a wall, I thought she could see him. I believe in the paranormal, although I've never experienced anything personally. A few months passed, and my mum was still smelling matches, although she hadn't seen the burned man since that day in the kitchen. I started to forget all about it, and made plans to move into a new house with my partner. We had since reconciled. One night, my 19-year-old sister Megan had her friend Cassie over. I was in my room with my kids. My parents were reading in their bed, and Megan and Cassie were hanging out in Megan's room. I was laying in my bed, watching TV. Must have been around midnight. My kids were asleep. Then I heard this scream. A scream that turned my blood cold. It sounded horrifying. I jumped out of bed and opened my door around the same time my mum and dad opened theirs. We looked over into Megan's room. Her door was open, and we saw Cassie sobbing hysterically, sitting in Megan's lap. Megan looked confused. She was stroking Cassie's hair, asking, "What's happened? What's wrong?" My dad went back into his room, assuming it was just girl problems. My mum went into Megan's room to talk to the girls. She shut the door behind her. I went to the kitchen and got a drink, then sat in the living room to wait for my mum. About 20 minutes later, my mum came out of Megan's room, shutting the door behind her. I asked her what happened. My mum sat next to me and told me this. Cassie was reading a magazine on Megan's bed, laying towards the foot. The position she was in, if she looked up, she was looking out into the hallway. She happened to look up. She said she saw a bloody-looking, melted, bald man dragging himself down the hallway. He was using his arms to pull his body and his legs down the hall. His legs and torso were dragging as he made his way to Megan's room. Cassie then screamed and jumped into Megan's lap. Megan saw nothing. My sister was very skeptical and laughed at Cassie, but she swore on her mother, who had recently passed away, that it was true. I remember the goosebumps I got after hearing that. I didn't even want to look down the hall. Megan's door opened, and out came the swollen-eyed, tear-stained face of Cassie, with a coat and her backpack on. Her and Megan left, I assume back to her home. I never saw Cassie again. She refused to ever come back over. And that was it. I ended up moving a month later, and my mum saw the burned man no more. But what made me want to tell this story, though, is something that happened last week. I went to my parents to visit, and only my brother was there. Out of the blue, he says, "Hey, you're gonna think I'm crazy, but I think there's something in the basement. I keep seeing flashes of red out of the corner of my eye." So, as of right now, I told my mum what my brother said, and those two are sharing their stories with each other. My mum never told anyone except me about the burned man. My plan is to do some investigating, look into the house and the previous owner who died in the fire. I wonder what he wants, why he only shows himself to certain people, and why he does it so sporadically. I'll make sure to thank him for not showing himself to me. Number 2. So, before we start, some background. I have a group of friends, and we've all known each other since kindergarten. There's 4 of us, me and 3 more guys. We're all 29 or 30 at the time of writing, and we're 28 or 29 at the time of the event. We're all really close, even though ever since college we meet up very rarely. All of us were in long-lasting and steady relationships, either married or the modern equivalent. That is, except for the main subject in this story, who had just come out of a pretty messy divorce. This friend, Andy, had been having a really rough time of life, as his ex-wife decided to leave him right as his mother was dying of cancer. So it was understandable that we were all a bit worried about him. Well, one of my friends has a pretty nice country house that's far away from civilization, far enough to allow for a nice weekend retreat every once in a while. At the start of this story, we had one of those trips scheduled. The week before, as we were all planning the retreat, Andy decided he wasn't going to go because he didn't want to be the only one without a significant other for the entire weekend. We all insisted, but we kind of understood his feelings, and since he had another event lined up during that weekend, we left it alone. Still, I wasn't really satisfied with that, as I felt he could really use the change of scenery. So I decided to give him a call on Saturday morning, right before I left for the country house, offer him a ride, and give him one last chance to show up. I called him from the door of my house, and he sounded kind of weird on the phone, like he was sluggish or something. I even joked with him about it. It was kind of early, and I assumed I had just woken him up. He didn't laugh or anything, so I figured he was pissed. When I offered to pick him up and give him a ride, he simply replied, "Okay." I told him to pack up a change of clothes and meet me in front of his house. Then off we went. It was me, the wife, and him in the car for a nice 45-minute drive. I started noticing things were off just as he got into the car. He was acting really stupid. I have no other way to put it. He didn't get any of the jokes, had trouble understanding simple questions, and kept replying with either a simple yes or no, or with a really slurred, short phrase at the most. At this point, me and the wife had every reason to be worried about him. We started thinking maybe he'd fallen into some weird state of depression or started doing drugs. He refused to acknowledge that anything was wrong with him, and so we simply drove on, hoping he'd maybe open up later on. So, we all arrived. There was food and drinks and video games. Yes, we get away from civilization to play video games, and since we'd all been friends for over 20 years, there was lots of fun to be had. It quickly became obvious to all of us that Andy wasn't acting right. He wasn't playing any games, wasn't talking at all, and spent most of the time just looking at us or outside. As time went on, I noticed he wasn't eating or drinking anything at all, and one of the guys swears that he kept tabs on Andy and never once saw him go to the bathroom the entire trip. We tried to get him to talk, but he'd just give the exact same response every time. "I'm okay." He ended up winning the patience game, and so we all just left him to his own devices. The night went on. He sat on a bench outside, looking at a stretch of woods near the house. We all stayed indoors talking, and then we decided to sleep. Andy said he'd go soon. He just wanted to chill for a bit outside. We all let him be. The next morning, he was sitting outside in the exact same place we left him, in the exact same position. That was it. I was completely freaked out and decided it was time to go back home. We packed our stuff and said our goodbyes. Everyone was really worried about Andy, but we all felt creeped out, so we just called it a weekend and left. I drove him home, dropped him off, and went back home myself. Later that night, we ended up all meeting each other again in a restaurant for a birthday get-together of a common friend. I noticed Andy was being himself again, and my other two friends looked really puzzled. I sat down and asked him, "Hey man, what the fuck happened yesterday?" He replied with something like, "Yeah, my car broke down, and Peter here had to pick me up in the middle of the night after the bar." Well, that made no sense, and so we all started asking questions and trying to piece everything together. Turns out, he was at the bar with a couple of the other guys at the exact same time he was with us at the country house. when we kept insisting, in a kind of panic, that that was impossible. Multiple people showed us pictures of him at said event. Yeah, there were fucking pictures. So we all freaked out, and noticing that we weren't joking, Andy freaked out as well. We confirmed via phone history that his phone in fact got my call that Saturday morning, but he doesn't remember answering it. After this, the talk did continue, but we really couldn't get anywhere, and that was it. As the months passed by, the three of us all got really afraid of Andy and who he could be. We still have no idea who was with us at the house, and Andy has gotten really sick of hearing about this, to the point of getting really mad when the subject comes up. He says that the most rational explanation is that we all got confused and thought this up. I'm still nervous about that to this day, especially because I dropped him off at his home and saw him enter. Where the fuck did fake Andy go? Did he do anything while we were all asleep? Do any of you guys know anything like this? I asked around, and nothing really fits. I'm not really a believer in the paranormal, but I don't have any other explanation. I felt like writing this to get it out, as the other guys and my wife don't really like talking about it. It gets everyone real nervous. Number 3. I'm not entirely sure whether you'd consider this strictly paranormal, but it's creepy and generally unsettling. Last week, I answered an Ask Reddit thread about the creepiest thing you'd ever seen driving. My story got unexpectedly popular. My inbox was assaulted for a couple of days afterwards, and everyone wanted to know the same thing. Where did this happen? I'll get to that, but first, I'll retell my story. Haven't posted here in a million years, but this seems like a good place to share this. A couple of friends and I drove into a horror movie once, totally by accident. It was either late November or early December, 5 or 6 years ago. I was deeply religious at the time, and we were headed to one of those living nativity things, where they have actors pretend to be the Virgin Mary and Joseph, the wise men and all that, and they kind of put on a show outdoors. It was held at a Christian campground outside of a nearby city, and we didn't know the area very well, so we had someone give us directions. This was winter in the US, so it was already getting dark when we set out. We got to the area just fine, but we forgot the name of the exit we were supposed to take to actually reach the grounds. Luckily, the campgrounds had a big sign right next to an exit, so we assumed this was the way to go. We took this road and thought nothing of it. Crisis averted. The city next to these campgrounds is actually pretty large, and the exit we took is very close to a shopping district, so it wasn't like we started in the middle of nowhere. Very abruptly, however, this exit turned from civilization to deep woods. We figured, well, it's a campground, so that's about right, and we kept on driving. Pretty soon, we passed a clearing on the right. The clearing was maybe 50 foot, and then woods again. At the very edge of these woods was this huge stone gate with wrought iron doors. It looked like a cemetery gate, but it didn't lead to a path or anything, just more trees. Had no fence around it either, just the gate. We kept on going, remarking to each other that it was kind of creepy, but still, we didn't think much of it. It was starting to get foggy at this point. A little while later, we came to some houses. This is where things got weird. The first house was just a standard white suburban home, but in the driveway, which was very short, was a van with all its doors open. The hazard lights were on too, like the car was on, but nobody was in it or around it. The house was completely dark. We were a little nervous now, wondering if maybe something bad had happened, like an accident or something like that. and the driver of our car slowed down to look. Then, my other friend in the front pointed ahead. As it turns out, all of the houses in this street were like this, on both sides of the road. Lights out, cars in the driveways, all of the car doors open, and the hazard lights on. At this point, we're more than a little freaked out, thinking we've driven straight into Silent Hill, or a particularly mean prank if nothing else. Though it seems a little strange for there to just be a community-wide prank in the middle of winter, nowhere close to Halloween. We still haven't seen any people. For whatever reason, we continued to drive, maybe to get out of there faster. There was a little bend in the road, and the instant we started through it, this massive black dog, sort of a German Shepherd looking thing, came out of nowhere and ran full tilt at the driver's side of the car. I'm still not sure if the dog actually made contact with the car, but if not, it came incredibly close. After charging us, it didn't retreat. It stayed in the road, barking its head off. Our driver did a quick U-turn, and we got out of there as fast as we could. Just ditched the nativity thing and never tried to go back. We found out when we got home and talked to the person who gave us directions that it wasn't even the right exit we were on. And now, several years later, we're not exactly sure which exit we took that night. All I know is I'm glad we chose to get out of there when we did. I don't want any part of what was going on over there that night. No thanks. High bars. As I said, most people wanted to know where this happened, but I also got messages telling me it was obviously fake or that I made it up. That kind of grated on me, and I started to question it myself. I wondered if I'd somehow dreamed it up or confused it with a movie or something, even though other people were there with me. So, Thursday this week, when I had to pass by that area again, I decided on a whim to go looking. I didn't have a certain time I needed to be anywhere, so I just popped down all the exits along that stretch. The first one just took me to a pretty normal little town. The next one was pay dirt. I'll go ahead and start by saying that some things are different from how I laid them out in the story. For example, it's not as heavily wooded as I recall, though there are still lots and lots of trees. I'll chalk that up to the passage of time and it being foggy and dark when the incident happened. Anyway, here's that gate I talked about. The wrought iron parts are gone, but I'm pretty sure I saw them in the brush nearby, dismantled. There does seem to be a road through it. Not sure if that was overgrown or I just didn't see it before. I didn't see a house or any buildings. There's a rock face and trees back there, so I'm not sure where one would be. I'll assume that the name on the gate is the name of the property owners. Here's the house we first came to, the one that had the van in the driveway. It's actually right across from the gate, but otherwise it looks the same. Also, it's abandoned. Next to it is this even creepier abandoned house. Further up the road are more houses, many of which are empty or for sale. There's a bend in the road that isn't the one I described, but then, a little further on, is this one. That's where we got charged by the black dog. The hedges still look the same. As a side note, I encountered maybe 2 cars the whole time I was down there, which was roughly around 20 minutes. For being one exit past a town, this place is pretty secluded and empty. So, there you go. On one front at least, I didn't imagine this. The place is real, and I found it. It's just outside of Springfield, Ohio, if you take the Lower Valley Pike exit off of Route 4. I do ask that anyone who decides to go adventuring be respectful of the people who live there, and of the general property laws. Try going on a foggy night midwinter. Let me know what happens. Hi guys, Lazy here, and thank you very much for listening. Sorry there's been such a long gap between uploads recently. There's been a lot going on in life, and needless to say, it's slowing me down a bit. But hopefully things will get back on track very soon. I've also got a couple of good video ideas in the works, ones that I don't think have been covered in a while, if ever, so yeah, we'll see how those play out. And leave any suggestions you might have for video ideas down below if you have any that are interesting, shall we say. Anyway, if you did enjoy this video, then please smash that like button or I'll smash you, and I'll be back again, hopefully very, very soon. Stay spooky, Lazy Legion. And remember, the best things happen in the dark.